Hey World History, this is Miss Corey. Welcome to U7-L2 Intro to Middle Age Europe. I'm going to speak pretty fast today, so I am sorry if I speak, really fast. But if you have any questions, do let me know. I'm more than happy to answer them. So you're going to watch this ed puzzle answer the questions. Questions I will ask you during this video today will be in blue text. Make sure you're following along with your study guide because any vocab word or important concept is going to be in red text. And of course, if you have questions, please let your teacher know. We are here to help you. Learning targets: compare and contrast the cultures in Eastern and Western Europe, including the impact of diseases and climate change. So we'll touch on topics like the Black Death, Byzantine Empire, Eastern Orthodoxy, and the Roman Catholicism. We won't touch all of those today because we'd be here all day with this video, but we will get to these as we go through the Unit 7 calendar. So here is a screenshot of the Unit 7 calendar. You can, of course, find this on Schoology. So we are up here in week 1. Kind of, ed puzzles, video choice, things that you guys are all used to by now. We also have kind of a little documentary to watch after winter break. And then the one thing that I really, really want to point out, and I know that it's like, wait, we're only like in week 1. Why are you pointing out something in week 4? It's so important that I want to point it out right now. So this is the last unit of the semester. So at week 4, you have this one assignment here. Is England and France in the 100 Years' War. And then you also have the Unit 7 test. Now, this assignment here, the Unit 7 test, the study guide, and all other assignments are going to be due January 16th at midnight. So let me repeat that again, because typically assignments are due Sunday at midnight, but since week number 4 is the last week of the semester, your Unit 7 test, U7-L13, and the Unit 7 study guide are due Thursday, January 16th at midnight. Okay. So again, this is the last unit of the semester. There is no final test covering everything we learned. Like sometimes teachers have, like, from unit 1 to 7, we'll take a big test, see what you remember. We do not do that in this class, okay? Your final test is the Unit 7 test, which is just like a normal multiple choice test. Okay, there's nothing too special about it. So again, please note that the study guide, U7-L13, and the Unit 7 test are due Thursday, January 16th at midnight. If you do not turn them in on time, it will be a 0 and there will be no way for you to make that up. Okay? It will be a 0. So here is a question. When is the Unit 7 test and study guide due? Hopefully you said Thursday, January 16th at midnight. All right, now let's start our slideshow. So you're like, okay, the Middle Ages. Yeah, but I've heard other names for the Middle Ages. Like, what's the Medieval Ages? What's the Dark Ages? How are they different? Really great question. So let's say you're, I don't know, watching a documentary for fun or watching a YouTube video and they say the Medieval Ages or the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. And you're like, what does that mean? They all mean the same thing, okay? So the Middle Ages, Medieval Ages, and Dark Ages, same thing, okay? So when you think of the Middle Ages, what do you think of? There's a lot, because it's 1,000 years of history that we're going to smash up in less than 4 weeks. So you might think of the Crusades. We'll talk about that towards the end. You might think of castles. You might think of artwork and unicorns and ladies with little flowing dresses. You might think of knights. We'll talk about them too. You might think of monks and their amazing hairstyles. You also might think of the bubonic plague, which we will for sure talk about. So, how did we get here? We got to kind of reverse back in time. So let's head back to Unit 4. So we talked about how the Roman Empire ended in 330. And there's various reasons for this, like being hard to govern because it was just super big, as you can see on this map. This red area is all the Roman Empire. Also invasions of foreign people, specifically up here where modern day Germany is. They like to come and attack the Romans. economic hardships, and the rise of Christianity. So the Byzantine Empire, we talked about them as well at the very end of the Roman unit. So they were from 330 to 1453, and they were founded by Constantine after the Roman Empire split into two. This is Constantine right here. And he was a very major supporter of Christianity. And he moved the capital to Constantinople. So here's a timeline. You'll actually see this timeline quite often as we go into the second semester. I add to it. So over here, we can see that the Roman Republic and Empire was from about 507 BCE to 330 CE. Then right after that started up the Byzantine Empire. Okay. Now the Middle Ages and the Byzantine Empire overlap. So the Middle Ages were from about 500 to 1500 CE, specifically in Europe. And you'll also see that at the very end of the Middle Ages is when the Renaissance starts to emerge as well. We'll talk about Renaissance at the beginning of next semester. I also like to put in kind of like big events that we've talked about so far up here on top. So, for example, in 610 CE, that's when the angel Gabriel was believed to talk to Muhammad, which was the start of Islam. So you can see that happened during the Middle Ages. The Mongol Empire starts in Asia. That happens during the European Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages is such a large period of time that at the very, very end, that's when Europeans start going over to North America. So, the Byzantine Empire saw Western Europe as hopeless. That is because there were so many small tribes trying to invade the once Roman lands that it was just pretty much chaotic. So, the Byzantine Empire, which again is located at Constantinople, which is right here, abandoned the Western Europe and focused on Eastern Europe by the year 568 CE. So there was pretty much a total split in politics from West and East Europe. So here's like, this is kind of like a little map I made up a little bit. So this line here, it's not like a solid line like this is where West and East Europe are. It doesn't really mean that, but this is kind of like where it split, over here being Eastern Europe, over here being Western Europe. Again, Constantinople's in here, and Rome, which is an important city still, is over here. And the Pope is located in Rome, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So, the Byzantine Empire left the city of Rome to fend for themselves. They literally abandoned their symbol of being the continuation of the Roman Empire, which is a huge problem because the Christian church's leader was the Pope, and he lived in Rome. And the Pope was not happy about that. So, we'll talk about what the Pope does for revenge in a little bit later in the slideshow. So, again, Constantinople, Byzantine Empire, they're like, oh, you're too much to handle Western Europe. Go fend for yourselves. Love your pal, the Byzantine Empire. And the Pope over here in Rome is like, wow, thanks for totally ditching me. For now, we are just going to talk solely about the Western Europe, and we'll talk more about Eastern Europe, like the Byzantine Empire, more in U7-L5. So, in the Middle Ages, European countries and kingdoms are in constant fluctuation. Like today in the modern times, right? Like there's borders with, like on our maps, and the borders stay fairly solid. Like there's not too many changes to borders in Europe. But during the Middle Ages, there were constant change in borders due to like battles over land and rivalries between kingdom. I mean, you can see on this map, oh, this tiny little text and all these little colors represent different things and movement of borders, and oh my gosh, messy. So there is so much to learn about the Middle Ages that we're just going to focus on a few things. So today we'll talk about feudalism and serfdom and peasants. We'll also talk just a smidge about Charlemagne. Women in the Middle Ages will be in a different day, and everyday life of peasants and knights. We'll talk about peasants today. So let's start with peasants. Peasants, they are a poor farmer who owns a small piece of land or rents it from the lord. They can also be called serfs. So if you're ever doing like reading or, I don't know, watching a YouTube video or something, and you hear the word serf and peasants are the same thing. A lord is a wealthy landowner. It could either be a knight, which would be a high-ranking soldier, or part of the nobility, such as like a baron, a count, or a duke. And they would live in a large countryside house called a manor. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. So this isn't a vocab word, but it is very, very important for understanding Unit 7. So if you're kind of zoning out, zone back in for just a second and listen to me. So feudalism, it is a type of political system. And that's when the king gave the land to nobles, such as lords. But in return, those nobles would pledge loyalty to the king. So nobles would then force the peasants to farm the land that they were given from the king. So peasants and lords worked under the social system of feudalism. So at the very, very top, we have the king. Below the king, we have the lords. So lords were considered the vassals to the king, so they would report directly to the king. So a vassal is someone who works under a higher authority. So like I said before, lords would be vassal to the king because they work underneath the king. In return, the lords would swear allegiance to the king. Lords also oversaw knights, as well as the farmland and the peasants, which is at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. 9 out of 10 people in Europe were peasants in the Middle Ages. They became peasants due to the lords and the church owning most of the farming land. So those poor peasants couldn't afford to buy the land, and the lords and the church had a monopoly on that land. Middle class in Europe pretty much did not exist. So either you were in the working low class, like being a peasant, an industrial laborer, miner, or craftsman, or if you were super duper uber lucky, you could be a noble or a priest. So to put it simply, life as a peasant was very sad. They rented the land to farm from the Lord. In return, they'd have to give the Lord the majority of their harvest. So they do all this back-breaking work, but yet they don't even get to keep their crops. They have to give them to the Lord. They also bought tools from the Lord. They bought clothes and other household items from the Lord. They rented their houses from the Lord. They didn't even own their own houses. So, take your best educated guess. What do you think is the problem with the relationship between the peasants and their lord? There's a lot of problems, but the one that I thought of is that peasants bought and rented everything from a lord. So the lord could just increase the prices anytime he liked. So that pretty much sucked the peasants dry of their money. So peasants would labor 54 hours or more a week. That include men and the women. And on top of that, the women also had to take care of the kids. Lords would live in these manors, like I talked about before. Here's an example of one in England. They are large stone houses or castles in the countryside. So 15 to 30 peasants would live in a one-room wooden house. Could you imagine that? 30 people in a tiny house. Probably stinky, smelly, loud, dark, dingy, all those sad words you could think of was how they lived. They also did not receive an education. They also could not leave the Lord's land. They had to stay in their village. Even if they tried to run away, they'd be captured and then brought back to the farm. And their average life expectancy was only 35 years old. Think of it. You guys watching this video right now, you'd be like halfway through your lives. So here is a kind of like an overview picture of what a manor might look like. So we have like the Lord's Manor House over here, nice, big, and pretty. You see that we have some shops and like the mill. There's usually like a church. Then you have all like the little cottages where all the peasants live. So take your best educated guess. Why do you think the lords didn't want the peasants to interact with other lords' villages and towns? So lords wanted full control over the peasants. They did not want the peasants to go into town because then they couldn't trade ideas. Peasants were also not educated, so they couldn't read and write and like send letters and write down ideas to spread ideas of like, I don't know, revolution or just at least better working conditions. So another kind of important thing is the population boom during this time. So in 950 CE, the earth began to warm. A warmer climate meant that more land could be farmed, which meant more food. More food meant that there would be more mouths that could be fed, which meant that they could sustain a higher population. So that led to more people. So in about 950 CE, there's about 25 million people living in Europe. From 1100 to 1445, the population of Europe tripled to 100 million people. Wow. That's crazy. That's a lot of people. All right, so enough about peasants. Let's talk about the Franks. So we will talk about the Franks for the next few slides. So we're going to start off with the Frankish territory, which is going to be kind of in this green area right here. Okay, so that's kind of their original territory. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, what we see as modern day Germany and France was not united. Small tribes ruled small areas of land, and there was constant changing of leaders, and there was constant wars and battles going on until dun 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 this dude Clovis comes along. So that's Clovis right there. So he ruled the Franks from 509 to 511, so not very long. So he was a king of a tribe of Germanic people called the Franks, and his wife, Clotilde, I don't know how to say her name, converted him to Christianity. So Clovis was battling a rival Germanic tribe, and he was losing bad. So he, out of like desperation, he's like, you know what? I'm going to pray to the Christian God, saying that if he won, he'd get baptized. So we've heard this story, a very similar story before. So what do you think happened to Clovis? Yeah, Clovis won. So he and 3,000 of his soldiers got baptized. And the Catholic Church was like, hey, Clovis, come here to Rome. I want to help you. You seem like a pretty successful guy. And Rome, again, was the capital of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church supported Clovis's military campaigns to defeat all of the Germanic tribes. By 511, Clovis did just that. He defeated all of the Germanic tribes. So all tribes, also called the Frank people, were now under the rule of Clovis. So we started off with this area on the map right here. And by the time that Clovis is done with his campaigning, he has all of this over here as well. All of this kind of more darker green territory. So, how do you think the Catholic Church spread Christianity to the Franks? Take your best educated guess. Yeah, it was tricky, right? Because we talked about before how peasants really didn't know how to read or write. So even if the Christians like sent them letters, they couldn't read it. And many parts of Europe were rural. There were no major cities with cathedrals. A cathedral is like a very large church. So the church decided to build monasteries. So a monastery is a Christian communities that include a church and then the people that work there. So the monks and the priests, which are male worship leaders, and also nuns, which are female holy followers. So monks, their job was to lead worship services. They also had this very important job of copying books by hand. So you have to think, so back in like the early Middle Ages, well, actually going all the way up to pretty much the mid-Middle Ages, there was no printing press. So if you wanted a book, it had to be copied down by hand. So monks copied books by hand, especially the Bible. They would also open schools, but of course, it was only for male students. They would also be historians and archive libraries. Nuns are the holy women. So, just like priests and monks, they also could not be married. But they were special because they were educated. They could be educated in things like Latin, arithmetic, grammar, music, morals, rhetoric, geometry, and astronomy. So, some women became nuns for religious reasons. Others had other reasons. For example, like if they're trying to run away from their family, or like she was in an arranged marriage and just was like, no, I don't want to do that. She could become a nun and kind of get away from that life. They also were scholars and wrote their own religious theories. So the church needed money to run. How were they going to get this money? They got the money through something called a tithe, which is a kind of tax. So 1/10 of all the money profits or food grown by a person must be given to the church as a tax. That was not optional. Lords gave the church 1/10 of the food the peasants grew. Craftsmen and like others would give 1/10 of their monetary profit to the church. And also, um, it was to support the church and also the monks and the nuns. So, through monasteries, nuns and monks spread Christianity to the locals. Missionaries also existed during this time. Missionaries are like nuns, monks, or everyday Christians that go out to non Christian land to spread the word of God. Um, they had that too. So Christianity becomes very popular in Western Europe. And became popular not only in the places that were once ruled by the Roman Empire, but far beyond that too, especially in Northern Europe. So the Catholic Church was centered in Rome, like we've said quite a few times now. So more and more Christian followers meant that there was more and more power to the church. In 590, Pope Gregory I, so this lovely looking dude right here, declared the church to be secular. Secular means that the church and its leaders have influence over politics across Europe, which will end up being quite the problem because it meant that the church and political powers were intermixing. A big example of this would be something called like a royal coronation. So here is a more modern day photo. So this was like what, back in the 50s when Queen Elizabeth II of England had her coronation? Was that in the 50s? Oh boy. Okay, so when you think of coronation, what does the ceremony usually include? Take a look at the picture if you need help. Yeah, it includes a lot of things. So they of course need like a crown. So coronation when a person is crowned king or queen, and they're given the crown of the kingdom. But there's also high-ranking priests, or in England, ministers that anoints the person becoming king or queen. So it is both a political and a religious ceremony. All right, now let's rewind back to the Franks real quick. So King Clovis died in 511, but by then the Franks had the largest kingdom in Europe, and they're also best friends with the Catholic Church. So again, here's a map. We talked before how kind of the darker green is what Clovis conquered in his lifetime. So after Clovis's death, the Frankish kingdom was split into four among his four sons. Okay, to be completely honest, we could sit here and talk about this for like another half an hour, but I really don't want to do that. So anyway, all you need to know is that the kingdom reunited as one by 700. And this dude named Charles Martel comes into power in 719. But Charles Martel is very interesting because although he comes into power, he is not the king. So instead, Charles Martel is the right-hand man of the king. The king at this time is Pippin, and Charles Martel's title is the mayor of the palace. So King Pippin is a figurehead. So we talked about this during the Japan slideshow. So it's kind of like with England today. The king is the figurehead, the prime minister has the real power. So even way back in the Middle Ages, it was a very similar concept. So with the Franks, the king is the figurehead, and the mayor of the palace, or called the major domo, was the one that held the real power. So again, Charles Martel is not the king. The king is King Pippin. Charles Martel is just the mayor of the palace. And the mayor of the palace, his original duties were just to oversee the working of the palace. But by 719, the mayor of the palace ruled over all the nobles. They're the ones making the law, and he's the one controlling the military, meaning that Martel has all the power. So under Martel, he would conquer modern-day France and all the way down south towards Spain. He would also expand east towards modern-day Austria. And in 732, he defeated a Spanish Muslim army, preventing that Muslim army from entering more of Europe. So Charles Martel died in 741. His son, Pepin the Short, became mayor of the palace. But Pepin the Short is not satisfied with just being the mayor of the palace, although mayor of the palace is the one with all the power. Pepin just also wanted to be king. He wanted both. So Pepin wants to be king. Pepin strikes a deal with the church. So the church has the power to make Pepin king. So Pepin's like, hey, church, if you make me king, I'll defeat those Lombards. And the Lombards were a rival group that wanted to invade the city of Rome, like we've said a million times, which is the church's capital. So the church is like, yeah, I think that's a pretty good trade. And Pepin does just that. He defeats the Lombards and he becomes the king of the Franks. So Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, and all of his descendants would be known as the Carolingian dynasty, which was a group of Frank rulers who ruled the Frankish kingdom from 751 to 987. So here's this big family tree that they have. So here's Charles Martel up here, then down there is Pepin the Short. And then we'll talk about Charlemagne in a couple of slides from now, but also you'll learn more about Charlemagne in a later lesson. So Pepin the Short died in 768, and the Frankish kingdom was left to two sons, Carloman and Charles. Carloman died, and Charles becomes the one and only king of the Franks. And then Charles changes his name after he becomes king, and he is now called Charlemagne, which is this dude right here. And you'll learn more about Charlemagne in U7-L4. So let's wrap this up. Today we talked about peasants, lords, manor, vassals, Clovis, Franks, monasteries, ties, secular coronation, Charles Martel, mayor of the palace, Pepin the Short, and Carolingian dynasty. Next up, you're going to do U7-L3, the video choice, what was life like in the Middle Ages. You're going to watch video A about knights. So you need to watch video A and answer the questions. Then after that, it is your choice to watch one of the other three videos I have listed on the video choice. Okay, just need to choose one of the other three videos. And of course, if you want the extra credit, you can watch all 4 videos, answer everything correctly, and then I'll give you 2 summative extra credit points on the test. And then after that, you're going to do U7-L4 Charlemagne. That's where it's like half my puzzle, half a video I got off of YouTube talking about Charlemagne. Yeah. If you have any questions, you want to learn more, please email your teacher. We are more than happy to help you out. And if you have any questions. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.